Here's the collapse of World Trade Center Building 7. This is from a distant perspective, nearly level with the roofline. The NIST has labeled Camera 2. We'll be referring back to that later. The building is 47 stories high and 100 meters side to side. It would approximately cover a football field. Many people have commented that it looks like it was in free fall, so I measured it. If you plot the velocity of the roofline versus time, the slope of the graph gives you the acceleration at any time during the fall. It does, in fact, fall precisely at free fall for 2.5 seconds, with sudden onset while maintaining a level roofline even as it falls, indicating that all support was completely and suddenly removed over a vertical extent of about 8 stories. Free fall is motion under the influence of gravity alone. It implies zero resistance. This is free fall. In free fall, all the potential energy of an elevated mass is used to generate the downward speed with no energy left over to do any other work. It can't crush anything, break anything, or throw things around. Any interaction with other objects would slow the fall. Therefore, a free-falling building could not possibly be what is crushing what's under it. The clear implication is the building was being demolished, and the top section of the building was not crushing what was under it, but falling in response to all the underlying support being removed. In August 2008, NIST released the final draft of their Building 7 report for public comment. Shyam Sunder, speaking for NIST at the subsequent technical briefing, denied that the building entered freefall. In his own words,
a freefall time would be an object that has no structural components below it. There was a structural resistance that was provided in this particular case, and you had a sequence of structural failures that had to take place, and where everything was not instantaneous.
He's arguing that free fall could not have happened in the case of a building crushing itself down, and he was right. The problem is, in the case of Building 7, we know that free fall did happen. Our measurements clearly show that it did. Therefore, by NIST's own logic, the building could not have been crushing itself down in a natural collapse. To bolster their claim, they made a blatantly erroneous measurement of the collapse of the building. They claimed the building fell 40% slower than freefall. They based this on a simple timing between what they claimed was the start of the collapse and an ending point 18 floors down. Here is the interval they timed. Each cycle of the little yellow clock represents 1 second. Overall, this time is 5.4 seconds. The problem with this measurement is easiest to see if we run it backwards in slow motion. Notice when the building actually starts to fall. And notice when they started their clock. Whatever was going on at the point they started their clock, it was not the start of downward motion. The building remained at full height for approximately 1.5 seconds after they started their clock. The problem with this measurement goes beyond just bad timing. The whole idea of free fall time is literally nonsensical, and they knew it. You can't characterize free fall in terms of time. To compare the motion of the building with the acceleration of gravity, you have to measure the acceleration of the building. That means tracking its motion throughout the fall, calculating the velocity at each point, and finding the slope of the graph. The scientists at NIST knew that the acceleration of the building was going to be a problem for their narrative, so it appears that they tried to skirt around the issue by talking about time instead of acceleration. NIST compounded their error by using an invalid equation to compute what they called free fall time. It's an equation from first semester high school physics that's good for what it's good for, but it applies only if you know in advance that the acceleration is uniform and the timing is started precisely at the onset of the downward motion. None of this applies in the case of Building 7. Not only did NIST make a false measurement and base it on a false methodology, scientists of the caliber employed by NIST had to know that this entire analysis was false. The question is why unquestionably competent scientists and engineers would knowingly produce such a transparently invalid analysis. NIST's final report, released a few months later in November 2008, had a revised analysis, but they characterized it as supplementing rather than replacing their earlier analysis. They continued to defend the earlier analysis. They used the same starting point that they used in the earlier analysis, and they again cited the same equation for freefall time. However, in the final report, NIST divided the collapse into 3 stages. They claimed that in the first stage, the time prior to the obvious downward motion we saw a minute ago, the roof line descended slowly as the columns low in the building buckled. Then in stage 2, which lasted 2.25 seconds, the buckle columns could no longer support the building, so it entered freefall. In stage 3, the acceleration decreased because the building started to encounter greater resistance. There's no problem with stage 3. In stage 2, they shaved off 1/4 second to add to their supposed stage 1 gradual transition time. The other factor that contributed to stage 1 is, as NIST admits, that they based their measurement on the view from camera 3, which is not a level view. It's looking up at the building at a steep angle from West Street. This camera shows what appears to be a dip in the roofline, but it's not. It's actually a lateral fold. It's like this. So let's say this represents the north wall of Building 7. It folded this way, and as seen from down below, looking up at the building, it looks like a dip. But if you see it from level, from a distance away equal with the roof line, it looks like a straight line. You can't see a dip. But basically, if it were dipping downward, it would appear to be dipping downward from all points of view. So it's clearly a lateral fold, not a vertical dip in the roof line. Interestingly, NIST knew that the V-shaped kink was not a dip, but actually a lateral fold because they come right out and say so elsewhere in their report. There are other camera views that show the lateral fold more clearly. In this one, you can see that on the right, the window lines are still horizontal, but on the left of the fold, they are angled outward toward the observer. The point they used to start their clock was not the actual start of downward motion. It's the same lateral motion they measured in their preliminary analysis. This is some kind of a local lateral instability high in the building, which has nothing to do with any buckling of the columns. Furthermore, NIST tracked only one point near the center of the roofline where the ambiguity in the fold was the greatest. They used this one point to mischaracterize the state of the roofline as a whole. Had they measured the corners of the building, they would have found nothing that even looked like downward motion prior to the onset of freefall itself. I know that because I measured both corners as well as the point near the center measured by NIST. This was part of the recent request for correction, which architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth and some others recently submitted to NIST, and which NIST has ignored. From a level view, only a tiny component of the lateral fold is visible under magnification, while the corners remain completely motionless. Then, with sudden onset, all 3 points, the center point and both corners of the building, entered freefall simultaneously to within 0.2 of a second. For the columns to buckle, they would have had to shorten. For the columns to shorten, there would have had to have been some initial downward motion, but there was no vertical motion prior to the onset of freefall. NIST claims the collapse was progressive from east to west, but even if that were possible, there was no time for progressive collapse. What we are seeing is synchronized removal of all vertical support across the entire width of the building, something which is characteristic of demolition, but cannot be accomplished by a progressive natural collapse. NIST's attempt to fix its original explanation, therefore, fails. One more thing. NIST is claiming that we are not really seeing the collapse of the building at all. They claim that the interior of the building collapsed a few seconds ahead of time, so all we're really seeing is the collapse of a hollow shell. This is a manifestly false claim, and there are several reasons we know that. First, when the east penthouse collapsed into the building a few seconds ahead of time, there was a cascade of window breakage beneath it. If the whole interior of the building had collapsed ahead of time, there would have been a lot more window breakage, but no further windows broke until after the onset of the overall collapse. Secondly, the internal girders were attached to the exterior of the building. So if they had failed ahead of time, they would have pulled on the exterior walls and severely distorted them. But during this period, there was no window breakage and no deformation. Third, direct observation shows that the west penthouse and other structures on the roof, which were supported by interior columns, remained in place to within a half second prior to the overall collapse. They are still visible even as the building is collapsing. And fourth, the roiling debris clouds that have been likened to pyroclastic flow racing down the street were not triggered by an earlier interior collapse. They were triggered by the visible collapse itself. In conclusion, what we are in fact seeing is the collapse of the actual building. We are seeing it collapse at the acceleration of gravity with sudden onset simultaneously across the whole width of the building, and NIST's explanations fail to account for it. Thank you.